Welcome to Let's Be Perfectly Queer,
a queer podcast creating space to talk about all things queer.
My name is Archie.
And I'm Katie.
And we are your hosts.
Questions of how you identify, seeking answers to clarify. Whether you're queen
or somewhere in between, let's be perfectly queer.
And we're back for season 3.
We are back for season 3.
Oh, it's a milestone, guys. I love it.
It is.
Joining us is the truly remarkable Dr. Lucas Wilson. Luke is a postdoctoral researcher in the University of Toronto, a former evangelical and a survivor of conversion therapy. During his time at Liberty University, the largest evangelical college, Luke underwent 4 years of conversion therapy, an experience that now forms a critical part of his groundbreaking research.
Luke is the editor of the recently released book, Shame, Sex, Attraction: Survivors' Stories of Conversion Therapy, which features 17 raw and powerful stories, including his own. The book is about surviving conversion therapy within Christian fundamentalist and evangelical contexts across the US, Canada, and Australia. This episode, we delve into Luke's story, the toxic roots of evangelical homophobia, and the journey to healing and advocacy.
All right, let's get into today's episode.
So, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for wanting to come on and getting in touch. So we have here with us today, Doctor. That's correct. You're now a doctor.
I am a doctor, believe it or not.
Congratulations on getting your doctorate. Oh, what do you call it in Canada? Is it the same thing? Would you call it a doctorate, a PhD?
Both and. I actually got it in the States, but I am Canadian. Don't mistake it. Don't mistake it, Archie.
I knew you were Canadian, and so I was like, let's not forget you're Canadian, because I know some Canadians hate when they get told that they're American.
Yeah, I think it's kind of like, what is it, the Australian-New Zealand sort of comparison where, you know, folks from New Zealand are like, how dare you? And those of us from Canada say the same thing, you know.
Totally get it. But thanks for coming on. Before we start, do you want to tell our listeners a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so my name's Luke, or Lucas Wilson, although I can never compete with like the Luke Wilson, right? Like that's always going to be a losing battle, the actor.
Yeah.
So I'm a postdoctoral fellow at University of Toronto, Mississauga, formerly a postdoctoral fellow at University of Calgary. Before that, I was doing the PhD, and I'm a researcher in the areas of history, religious studies, gender sexuality studies, literature, trauma. Most of my past research was actually in Holocaust studies. I looked at the intergenerational transmission of trauma between survivors, their children and their grandchildren. But over the past few years, I've begun splitting my focus and focusing more so, you know, on a daily basis on white Christian fundamentalism and evangelicalism, specifically in the US, so white Christian nationalism. And yeah, most of my research now has been focusing on conversion practices, which we're going to be talking about today.
Yep.
And I've been doing a little bit of work in creative writing, which is a new field for me, but very fun. And that's where the book that we're talking about comes from.
Very cool. I do like a bit of creative writing. I'm really bad at it. With my creative writing, it's more like songwriting and stuff, because I was never good at short stories or anything like that. It was just something that my brain did not like.
Right. No, I think if we all took a class, we'd be better. And so maybe we should just take a class together and learn together, I think.
Maybe we can do that. We'll Zoom in and learn together, and, you know, we'll see what your next book could be.
That's it. We're lifelong learners. Look at us.
Exactly. So your personal journey, your background, can you share what initially led you to Liberty University and how your time there kind of shaped who you are in your journey?
Yeah, I think Satan had something to do with it, because we'll get into that. No, so I wasn't even raised in a Christian home. I became a Christian going into high school in grade 9. I was really into like the creation versus evolution debate. My brother got into that, and so I started watching these like DVDs of this this guy named Kent Hovind, who did these debates about creation versus evolution, and he actually went to jail eventually for tax evasion. He said it was God's money, but the government seemed to disagree with him. So anywho, I got into, you know, I met Jesus that way, and started going to church, and really didn't stop for all of high school. And I was, you know, sort of on fire for Jesus kind of thing, and super like a zealot at the time. And somewhere along the way, I found out about Liberty. I got a free trip to go down there for a visit. And so I went, and, you know, everything's bigger in the US, everything's more exciting. And, you know, the college experience is like so cool. And so I went down and sort of was blown away by, this big, big university. It's massive. And at the time, everything that was Christian, in my opinion, was better, and it had to be better because it was Christian. And so I decided that I was going to go. And so I kept going down and visiting over the next few years. I was in grade 11. And by the time I was in grade 12, I had, accepted my offer, and I only applied there. And I went there. But a big reason why I even went, though, there was the Christian aspect, right? That I wanted to get my, my foundation and a Christian education. But the other big part of it was that I really wanted to become straight. And I knew that they had, or I was, led to believe I wanted to become straight, I should say more accurately. Nowadays, I don't want to be bored. So we don't want to be straight. But yeah, so I went down and when I was there on one of the trips, they had these like rotating announcements on the screens that they projected the lyrics for the worship music. And before and after chapel, what they called convocation, they had these ads for different on-campus, events or things that were offered. And one of the things that were offered was this pastor's services. He said something, it was something along the lines of like, do you struggle with same-sex attraction? I was like, that's me. And so I, decided that, or I sort of clocked it and I said like, okay, so this guy, he's offering this. And so I went to one of my friends and I was like, yo, who's this Dane Emmerich guy? That guy's name was Dane Emmerich, the pastor. I was like, what's this, tomfoolery about same-sex attraction? Meanwhile, I'm like this big old homo. And he says, oh, he's the guy on campus who helps, gay guys. So I was like, okay, well, that's perfect. And so, I knew that they had this program. And so for me, in my, teenage brain, I was sort of under the impression that, if I go here, this will be my ticket to heteronormativity and then, a life of godly normalcy, which of course never happened. Things happened instead, different things. And so, yeah, that's what eventually brought me down to Liberty. That was a big motivating factor, was actually the conversion therapy program.
Oh, wow. So you'd never heard about it before you saw it on this big kind of screen with worship lyrics, and that's the first time you've heard of it? Yeah,
it was because, you go down, there's like the chapel, sort of announcements, everyone's chit-chatting, and there's like the buzz of energy of the, what's to come, and, we're about to sing. And so then, you get into the music, and then there's the sermon, and then afterwards, again, there's these ads, and I remember looking up and seeing them there. That was, I guess it is sort of, what's the word, metaphorical. I thought it was on the same screen, and, I was, there was spiritual sustenance, and then there was this, or maybe, both fall into the same camp. Maybe I didn't really get it. Anyway, whatever. Yeah. So to answer your question, yes, Archie, yes.
Yeah. Liberty University, for those who don't know what Liberty University is it like a university that's for conversion therapy, or is it like underground, or... Because I've never heard of this university before.
Yeah, so Liberty is the world's largest evangelical university. And so, for those who aren't familiar with it, and, even those in the States aren't necessarily familiar with it, and thank God, count it a blessing. Liberty is this juggernaut of a political, religious institution. And so for anyone who knows who Jerry Falwell is, and I think if we were, I'm just assuming your age right now, but let's say we were 20 years older, I think we would both, really know who Jerry was, because Jerry Falwell was this really significant political, religious influence in the States. He was, kind of like the U.S. pastor, like America's pastor. Like once he sort of overtook Billy Graham, but it took it in a really dark turn, because Jerry Falwell was really bombastic. He was just incredibly, outspoken and said what he believed or said he believed. And, really stuck it to the man kind of thing. And so he's really, I think, in a lot of ways, like a precursor, or like someone who led to the political situation that we see in the U.S. today, where it's so divided, and Jerry Falwell had no room for, compromise. And he was very much committed to his convictions kind of thing. And I think that, if we were to draw a line between Jerry Falwell to Trump, it's a pretty clear line. Speaking of Trump, to give an idea of what this university is like, Trump has 2 honorary doctorates from Liberty University. He spoke there on Martin Luther King Day. Mike Pence has an honorary doctorate. Mel Gibson has been to the campus, even though he's Catholic. There are a lot of Michelle Bachmann, Candace Owens, Tommy Lauren, all these, nitwits, conservative folks. Yeah. They've all been there and been invited to speak on their chapel stage or just at the university. And so it's not a university that's hey, we're a conversion therapy university. Yeah. That's part of it, right? That's one of the aspects of it, or was for a long time, up until their in-house conversion therapist. My conversion therapist, Dane Emmerich, retired. I don't know the situation now, and so I can't speak to that. My inclination, or sort of what I assume, is that there is someone who's replaced him, but I don't know for sure. But all this to say, it's an incredibly conservative, upside down sort of like moral system. And, if we're talking about Australia, like Hillsong United, they're obviously charismatic and they're a little bit more, Pentecostal, and Liberty's Southern Baptist. But there are a lot of parallels, and Hillsong has been to Liberty. I used to love Hillsong when I was there. Like, I thought that Hillsong was everything. I still sometimes listen to Hillsong. It's a guilty pleasure. Don't tell anyone.
That's fine.
But yeah, it's terrible. But it's fine. That's it. No, so Liberty's this, and more recently, to give it a fuller picture into the hypocrisy that is evangelicalism. The president or the former president of the school, who was Jerry Falwell's son, his name was Jerry Jr. Jerry Jr. had a 3-way cuckolding relationship with his wife, a Miami pool boy, and himself. He was then ousted because of it. There's so much about this school that's just like bonkers and upside down land. But it's kind of like a Disneyland for evangelicals. And like, if you're anyone in a conservative or religious space in the US, like political or religious conservatism, then this is the place to be, and you're oftentimes connected to it in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And don't worry about Hillsong being your guilty pleasure. I grew up Catholic. There's just some songs that get stuck in your head. You're like, I haven't heard that song in ages.
There's that like unbelievably, I mean, this is all music really at the end of the day, but like the unbelievably manipulative, emotional aspect, right?
Yeah.
That you think like, oh gosh, this is the Holy Spirit that's working through me, the Holy Spirit. It's like, no, my friend, it's just like someone who's like a really good, like, musician and like composer and figured out how to pull on your heartstrings. But,
they're a great creative writer. That's what it is.
That's it. That's exactly it.
So as a former evangelical, what was the turning point that led you to step away from evangelicalism and begin the journey of writing and research?
Actually learning, not just sort of blindly accepting a lot of tomfoolery. No, I do. I mean that in actually a lot of ways. Higher education, I would say, saved my life. I mean, I went to Liberty, and the undergraduate education there, my undergraduate education there, was wildly disappointing. I got into grad school so underprepared. To give you an idea, normally for a master's thesis, if you're, submitting a proposal, you either get it on the first try or you get, rejected on the first try and you have to do some edits and then you get accepted. The worst I've ever heard was that 2 rejections and on the 3rd try, the person got it. I got rejected 7 times, and it wasn't until my 8th try that I finally got it. And so I was so woefully underprepared. And when I started going into these classes, I, of course, was learning a lot of stuff. Well, a lot of stuff in general. It was, it felt like I was finally learning in a lot of senses. And I was exposed to a lot of new authors, a lot of new theorists, a lot of new thinkers, a lot of new ways of thinking that I just hadn't, been exposed to before because I went to Liberty University.
Yeah.
And so when I was in grad school, I started thinking about, well, kind of everything. And I was reconsidering a lot of things. And, I started to even just like reflect on my experience in conversion therapy, which I didn't at the time I was in conversion therapy conceptualize it as conversion therapy. I always thought of it as just like pastoral counseling, and I was meeting with the pastor. But over time, I wasn't able to really, what's the word? The problem of me being gay wasn't going away, the quote unquote problem. I don't mean to say it's a problem, but at the time I saw it as a problem. I saw myself as a problem. And at the time it was, it was becoming unbearable trying to reconcile, the fact that I was gay. And I was realizing it was a fact. Before I didn't think I was gay. I thought I was just struggling with same-sex attraction, which is a way of divorcing, the individual from the sexuality.
Yep.
But I realized no, I'm a big old homo and this isn't going away. Like, this isn't changing. What do I do? And so at that point, I decided I wanted to go to divinity school. And so I started looking up different divinity schools, and you can't really get into a divinity school in Canada and get a scholarship. Like, you have to pay for it. So I was like, okay, let me go back to the States. So I went back to the States, went to div school. And it was there that I really started reconceptualizing my faith and reconsidering a lot of things, even something which sounds as simple as, as this, that I believed that, it was no longer that it was God's word, but words about God. And for those within the evangelical space, like, that's a huge paradigm shift. And that for me was like revolutionary. But I think a big thing too, in addition to, actually reading, gender theorists and theorists of sexuality and religious theorists, all this kind of stuff, all these different texts, I was also deciding that, okay, when I go to div school, I'm no longer just going to theorize first, which of course theology at the end of the day is just theory. I'm not just going to theorize or theologize first and then live my life and say, okay, I have to fit my life through this narrow paradigm. Instead, I'm going to live first and then let that shape how I think about the world. And so it was this reversal that I think was for me quite, a big deal. And so it was these two things, actually going to real schools that had quality educations, and then also just saying I'm going to, no longer live in a world of theory, but I'm going to live in my practical day-to-day life and then see how my theory is shaped by that, my lived experience, my embodied experience. And these two things really, I think, in a lot of ways saved my life, because I probably would be, married with children and a wife and oh, goodness gracious. Yeah.
Is that like a nightmare now, thinking about that? How your life could have ended up?
Oh God, a prison sentence, I think. I don't, oh goodness, I don't want children, that's for sure.
Yeah.
And I certainly don't want a wife, and I don't think a wife wants me. So I just think that it would be an absolute recipe for disaster. Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah, it's crazy when you think about it. And had you been so-called, I'm going to put in quotation marks, one of the converted, what your life could be had you not gone elsewhere and allowed yourself to learn and allowed yourself to give in to who you are.
Well, you know what? And I think we have a number of examples of folks who did exactly that, or the opposite, that I have. First of all, there's like the numerous leaders from the ex-gay movement, as it was called, still is somewhat called that mostly by us outside the camp. But, there were so many of these guys, right? And women that, who were leading these lives where they're saying, no, I'm changed, like God's changed me. And of course they haven't. And we all know that conversion therapy obviously doesn't work.
Yeah.
At this point, I certainly didn't know at the time, but that these folks are out there and they're living lives that are lies. And then eventually they just can't take it. And, they're at a gay bar and they get caught, or they're on Grindr and they get caught. Like, I have multiple friends from Liberty University who either went through conversion therapy with me or went through conversion therapy elsewhere and went to Liberty. And then they ended up marrying straight women, and all of them, I can think of, out of the three that I am thinking of, all of them, had children. And two of them are now divorced from their wives or in the process of divorcing. And then one is still in it to win it.
Oh, wow.
And I can think of one of them was actually the first guy I ever came out to at Liberty. And he's public with this now, so I don't think he would care at all. And in fact, I know he wouldn't care me sharing this. But he and I, we sort of came out to each other, and then he asked me that, and he said, "Have you ever been attracted to a woman?" And I said, "No." I said, "No." I said, "Yes, I'm bisexual," with no evidence to support that, right? Like, there's no woman had I been theretofore or now have I been attracted to. So, but he said, "No, I've never been attracted to a woman." Well, he got married, he had children. And then eventually, he broke free. But he was saying that the other guy, who I had a big crush on this other guy, and I actually write about it in the book in Shame, Sex, Attraction. This is the guy I talk about. This guy, he and my friend were talking, and my friend was saying, I'm probably going to be like, my wife and I are going to, break up and we're not going to be together anymore. And this guy, who I write about, my big crush, he got super angry apparently. And of course, the reason why he's angry is because he's angry at himself, right? Like, he's like, no, you can't leave because I'm not leaving. And if you leave, then there's like one less of us. And, then it's harder to sort of bear this burden of an inauthentic, lie of a life. And so I think that, I see these examples of folks who went through conversion therapy. I see these folks who gave it the good old college try. Like, they really did, go beyond what I did, which I did go to conversion therapy for 4 years. And I did, experience a lot of, bullshit. But for them, they really took it to the next level by marrying, straight women and having children and really trying to have that, life that they were told is the only way that you can be happy and the only way you can be a Christian. And then they realized, they said quite quickly that it just wasn't working, and they were stuck in these, jails of marriages. Yeah.
And that's the thing, your crush, probably just so angry that someone else had the guts to go ahead and do what he really wanted to do. And so then you act out in anger. And that's the most thing. When you're jealous of something or you don't understand something, for some reason, as humans, we automatically go to anger. So is he still in a relationship?
Still in a relation with a woman, yeah.
You feel for him because obviously there's so much background and trauma that has not allowed him to actually be himself.
Yeah, and you know what? And it's one of those things where it's like also on the opposite end. For a long time, I felt really angry at them, you know, and I was like, you make my life harder. I mean, they do, right? Like they do ultimately by staying in the closet. There's less queer visibility, and I was super angry at them. And I think that now I think I have a little bit more compassion, and I think back that that could have been me, right? Like it really could have been, and for a number of reasons it wasn't, but it could have been. And so I can understand their anger, right? Like it's all projection. It's just like anger at themselves that they're projecting onto others. And for me, I don't know where my anger came from, but I was angry with them for a long time too. I was like, well, if I could do it, you can too. But I also know that I had a different situation. I wasn't raised in the church. I didn't have only that world that I was coming. I didn't come from only that world. I knew life outside the church, not too well, but certainly enough that, because by the time I was 14, I was, again, I was sort of drinking the Kool-Aid. And by the time I left, it was, 25, 26. So it had been a 10-year sort of like, majority of my teenage year, well, almost all my teenage years and into my adulthood that I was part of this. And so anyway, no, I feel terrible for these folks, and I'm so glad that a number of these guys have gotten out, but there still are a lot of people who are in it and are stuck and don't really know how to extradite or sort of emancipate themselves from this system.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And so with conversion therapy, it's deeply personal to the person who's going through it. It's painful for a lot of survivors or those who come out of it. And in that, what was it like for you, and what was your motivation for sharing your story and wanting to share it in a book?
Yeah. So to give a quick definition for anyone who might be, a little unsure about what exactly we're talking about, conversion therapy is the attempt to change someone's sexual orientation, gender identity, or gender expression. And this is obviously within a queer context. People are trying to make queers straight, or at least straighten them out a wee bit, to such an extent that they find at least one woman or one man or, one person that they're attracted to, that unicorn of a person who never shows up. But so conversion therapy for me at Liberty was largely by way of talk therapy. And so I talk about in the book, I give the story of when I went to the group conversion therapy program, but I only went to that once. And that's the one time that I went, and I tell the story there. The other experience that I had was the one-on-one therapy, which was over the span of 4 years. And the reason why I told the group therapy is because I'll be writing the individual therapy for another book. So saving that one for later. We'll get to it. But for me, it was with this man by the name of Pastor Dane Emmerich. And Dane Emmerich was one of those ex-gays, married and had children and grandchildren, all this kind of stuff. And so with my experience, I mean, it began very much in this like pseudo-Freudian approach to human sexuality, where we would talk in the very first few sessions about, like, what was my childhood like? What was it like growing up with mom and dad? What was my relationship to both? What was my relationship like with my siblings, to my sister and my brothers? And then, thinking about, how did any of that map onto or fit their theory about where I went wrong? And the way I went wrong, according to this thinking, is that I was too attached to my mom, which I was. Like, I was a mama's boy.
Yeah.
She was overbearing. Cheryl's wild. So that certainly fit the narrative. The problem was that my dad was phenomenal. Like my dad was arguably like much more involved in my life than my mom. And like, came to all like my soccer games, my chess matches, my dance recitals, all this kind of stuff. And, I think that for them, they're not looking for consistency, and never should we look for consistency with evangelical, right? There is like some sort of an internal logic according to how they think and what they think, and what they're going to think. It just doesn't mean it's consistent. How there's like a way of thinking. It's just, again, wildly, all over the place. And so
yeah,
for me, that was okay that my dad was, fine. They were like, okay, let's just like brush that under the rug and focus on your mom and your relationship. And, my siblings, my brothers, like growing up, they were a bunch of jerks. And so that also fit the narrative. And then also like, oh, you were playing with your sister's dolls and like eating her makeup when she was at school and, playing with like her dresses and in the closet, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
I was like, yeah, all of that. Like, of course I was. And so
yeah.
That also fit the narrative. And so what they say is that, and what I was told was that, by the time I hit puberty, wherever I was on the gender spectrum, because really at the end of the day, conversion therapists in a specifically religious context, it's all about gender and how you identify gender wise. That'll determine your sexuality. So if you are as a young, gay boy, doing the things that girls do and playing with girls' toys and, hanging out with girls and socializing with girls, you're in the world of girls. And so by the time you hit puberty, you apparently go to what's opposite of you. Like you're attracted to the opposite. Because again, evangelicals operate in a binary system. It's everything's like opposite. This, male, female, right, like boy, girl, right, wrong, good, evil, of the enemy, of God, whatever. So for me, I was apparently living in the world of girls. And so I had to, was completely sort of invested in femininity. So when I got, hit puberty, I was going to go for what was opposite, which was boys. And so then over time, as I went for what was opposite of being habituated that, those desires and those and acting on those desires, that's when it really sort of concretizes or solidifies the sexuality. And then over time, I eventually struggled with same-sex attraction. According to this thinking, everyone's actually a latent heterosexual. Everyone is by nature and default straight. It's just that some deviate and, are attracted to men or are attracted to women depending on, their struggle. And so for me, and so what they say is that, okay, so if you have this struggle, the way to fix it or the way to correct it is for you to rehabituate a different gender performance. So if you are, again, habituating that feminine gender performance and you're acting according to the scripts of femininity, what you just need to do is flip the script. You need to start acting like a man. And over time, as you act like a man, you're not just going to act like a man. You're going to actually be a man as you perform a certain brand of heteronormativity, of, hegemonic sort of masculinity. Yeah. And, over time, that performance will not be a performance. It'll be instead just a natural function of who you are. And that's what affords the delusion that you can change, right? That it's not just that, you try to be straight. It's that you try to be masculine. And then in turn, your sexuality will change. Yeah. And so that's what I was taught. And so in these first few sessions of, what was your relationship like with your parents and your siblings, that then turned into, over time, we started, going into a different sort of routine. The routine was reading the Bible, reading this text, this conversion therapy manual. Mine was Alan Mettinger's Growth into Manhood, Resuming the Journey. Wow. So again, this idea that you stopped the journey of, masculinity or manhood, and now you're going to go back on to the path, and this on the straight and narrow, pun intended. So there was reading this manual, there was reading scripture, there was prayer. I never prayed for myself in these sessions. It was always Dane praying for me, which I think is quite symbolic, right? That he was interceding on my behalf, and I wasn't able to. Not that I wasn't able to, just that I didn't in these sessions. And then there was also this weekly inventory, right? So my slip-ups and my victories. Slip-ups were times that I gave into temptation. Victories were times that I avoided temptation. So we would talk about these things, and he always asked really, probing questions, detailed questions about what I was, into, and what kind of porn do you like, and okay, what are you attracted to? Yeah, wildly inappropriate, very weird. Obviously, I know why now he was asking these questions, but was very, greedy for details about what was going on behind closed doors. And so then we would have these sort of almost confessional, confession moments, and those were big parts of it. The other part that I look back on and I just cringe is the tactile aspect, which was that, every time I'd see him, he'd give me this big bear hug. And every time I would say goodbye, he'd give me a big bear hug. But he'd also, whenever we were praying, he'd put his hand on my shoulder or on my leg. And not on my inner thigh or anything, but certainly further than you should probably ever. Yeah, you know what I mean? It's just what the hell? And at the time, evangelicals have no boundaries. There's no such thing as personal boundaries within that religion. And so you're primed to be okay, I guess this is fine. And, again, it wasn't too weird, but it was weird. You never really liked it. And he was this older man that just anyway, he was once described in a student newspaper as as Yoda. He looked like Yoda. So just wasn't a cute moment. And so he was just this, anyway, so there was that. And I always think about it now, and I think about it as him almost modeling good touch, bad touch, as if I was a 4-year-old. And him sort of saying this is how men can relate physically to each other. Meanwhile, of course, what is he thinking in his head? Probably other things,
completely different
just
things.
Creepy. Yeah. Just wild. Oh God. So bizarre now. So that was a big part of it, but and I tell this experience and people will oftentimes say, well, that doesn't sound too bad. That doesn't sound terrible. That you read scripture, you read a book and whatever, and you confessed your quote unquote sins. But the thing is that for conversion therapy, for me and for a lot of survivors, is that, the violence isn't so much what happens in the moment. Because oftentimes when I would confess, when I would tell him these things, you felt better in the moment. It was like almost like you were alleviated of your guilt. Like you had done something wrong, you felt guilty for it, and then he's like, no, like, yes, that was wrong, but let's move forward. Let's like focus our eyes on Christ, and we'll get through this kind of thing. So you always felt kind of better in the moment. The problem was that once I left Liberty, I still remember I was standing in my split level apartment. I was standing over the sink. It was like only the light above me on, and Canada gets dark very early in the winter. So it was like it felt like 5 o'clock, and it's like pitch black out. And I'm standing there, and I was like praying, and I was like, God, like what the hell? And I've tried so hard to become straight. I said, and I didn't again conceptualize it as conversion therapy, but I said, like, I met with Pastor Dane. I've read my Bible. I've been consistent with like doing what you want me to do. I fasted. And if you count the number of weeks that I fasted, I just didn't eat because I thought that God, I was focusing my attention and energy on God and not on food. It would have been like weeks and weeks and weeks of not eating. And so, so all of this together, I was like, God, like, what the fuck? Like, I've done so much, and I've tried and I've tried and I've tried. Why aren't I changing? And I think that for me, it was, again, like I used to have that mechanism to alleviate the guilt, which was Dane. But then, without him, because he kept promising, right? There's this like cruel optimism that he kept instilling in me over the 4 years. Like, it'll be fine. You'll work through this. There's victory in Christ, these sorts of messages. And so you have this twisted hope that you will change. And then when you don't change, you think to yourself, okay, and again, within the system, it's that God is perfect. And God wants you to be, to go for a woman and be straight or to find attraction to women. And if in fact God's perfect and God's, not the problem, what's the problem? Well, it's you. You're the problem, right? Like you're the issue that's not allowing, God to work. Something that you're doing or somehow who you are just won't allow this. And so that guilt turns into shame, right? Where shame is not just like, oh, I've done something bad. Shame is that I am bad. Right. And I am gross. I am defective. I am dirty. And so it was these messages that Dane had given to me, the really explicit messages, like you will find victory in Christ. Just keep your eyes on the prize, kind of thing. And when that didn't happen, that guilt turned to shame, and that shame turned to self-hatred, where it's like, no, like you're disgusting. You're, like you're not worthy of love. You're not worthy of God. And like, ultimately you're going to go to hell. Right. And so I think for me, the violence of conversion therapy came after, where it was these promises that were given to me. It was these scripts I was told to follow that just weren't obviously working. And eventually it forced me or pushed me to really hate myself for a long time. And eventually, again, going to school and studying and having conversations with people who didn't believe what I believe, thank God, allowed me that sort of exodus out. But it certainly was this like long sort of drawn out process that really, did a number on my, I guess, mental health and emotional health and spiritual health, all these things, right?
So as you're talking, there's a few things that come to mind. With this pastor, it's almost like he's preying on your weakness, like what people do to gamblers. You prey on the weakness, you give them hope. It's going to be the next one. It's going to be the next one. It's going to be the next one. And then they feel shame. They feel self-hate and all that kind of stuff. So it's almost like this pastor's kind of knows what your weakness is, and he's preying on that to kind of be, I don't know what the word is, but to kind of be like that person that you go to and that kind of power and hold that power over you. Am I kind of on the right track there?
100%. He was like this mentor, right? He was this coach. And within conversion therapy, it's actually explicitly talked about. Like Joseph Nicolosi is this, like, not the father of conversion therapy, but he's certainly a bigwig and influential person within that world. He would write about how the conversion therapist for young gay men, if the conversion therapist was a man, he was functioning as like a proxy father, like this like stand-in father. And so they established themselves as these like father-like or grandfatherly-like figures. And again, that's this like affective or emotional bond where you don't want to disappoint your dad. You don't want to disappoint your grandpa, your mentor, your coach, your ego ideal, right? The person that you want to be. And for us, we wanted to be him because we were like, look at him. He got married. He had children. He had grandchildren. He's telling us that life is great. Everything seems to be good with him. And so, you have this emotional bond with this person who's, again, promising you change if only you are to follow the program of, action and doing what, you're supposed to do according to what he says you're supposed to do. And it's this way of conditioning you and emotionally, right, like using these emotions that, again, at the time, like guilt, there's this almost like need to rely upon him, right? Like to keep going back for more. And in some ways, like, it's this like dependency that sort of like is established where you need to keep going back to him to make you feel better. And then every time you go back to him, you feel better, but then you go away and then things aren't good. So you go back to him and then you feel better. And then, right. And again, this is the dynamic that we're talking about, at least in this specific context at Liberty and a number of other contexts that we see in the collection in the book. But this is really, in a lot of ways, this is what happens within conversion therapy contexts.
And so for you, it sounds like your experience with conversion therapy is mainly the one-on-one talk therapy as part of your conversion therapy?
Yeah, so that was my experience. I mean, the book gives voice to a number of other experiences too, right? And there's not every experience, obviously, represented in the book. There are people, for instance, the very first story, it's aversion therapy. So using something to make you, to associate something gross, something negative with homosexuality, and then trying to use that as a way to be grossed out by queerness. And the very first story, again, if for when folks read the collection, it's literally this guy smelling like dog shit. Like that's what he's told to do. And so that's an example of aversion therapy. There's electroshock therapy. I was recently put in touch with someone who underwent electroshock therapy, which is another form of conversion therapy that people experience. But there are a whole host of examples of conversion therapy and conversion practices writ large that people undergo, and whether it be talk therapy or other perhaps less direct messaging that people receive. There are a number of ways that conversion therapy operates, and this is certainly a prominent one. And again, especially the fact that it's in an evangelical or a Christian space. Most conversion therapy these days happens in religious contexts, specifically Christian contexts. And so my experience in a lot of ways has a lot of similarities to other people's and obviously has some differences. Mine was in a university setting, which is not always that common, though it certainly does happen at a number of Christian universities and colleges and seminaries. But a few other stories give voice to that too. But sometimes it happens, obviously the pastor's office in a church, at a church ministry, or, even within like the family at home. There are a whole bunch of ways that conversion therapy operates, and the collection gives voice to a number of these experiences.
Yeah, and you spoke about shame, and so your book is called Shame, Sex, Attraction. Is that where the title came from? And what do you hope readers will take out of being able to read your series? Is it like an anthology kind of different stories?
Yeah, anthology, edited collection, edited volume, whatever.
Yeah,
all of these descriptors work. So yeah, I mean, being queer, we love a good pun. Come on,
Yep.
A little play with words, a dad joke or a daddy joke. I don't know. So shame, sex, attraction. It's a play on obviously same-sex attraction. So within conversion therapy context, within Christian context, queers are said not to be queer. They're said to be those who struggle with same-sex attraction, which again is a way of divorcing the sexuality from the individual and saying, "Oh, you're straight. You just have this like sin that you're dealing with." And so. Obviously, it's not true. Obviously, like people are attracted to men not because they're struggling with same-sex attraction. They're made to struggle with it because people make them struggle with their sexuality. It's because they're queer, and so that's kind of why it happens. So the thing is, with the title "Shame, Sex, Attraction." So with conversion therapy, it's a play on same-sex attraction because what brings people into conversion therapy is shame, right? Yes, there are people who are forced to go, and yes, there are people who, are just there like waiting to get the hell out, just sort of biding their time until, their parents don't force them to go anymore. But a lot of people, a majority of people go in because they are ashamed of themselves. They feel bad or made to feel ashamed of themselves for their queerness or their same-sex attraction. The other thing, though, is that conversion therapy doesn't just like predicate itself upon and necessitate shame in order for folks to be there. Because again, they wouldn't be there if they didn't feel ashamed. But it also amplifies that shame, right? It makes it more intense. It intensifies it. It makes it stronger. In a recent Canadian study, the number one consequence of conversion therapy that was cited by survivors was shame. So it's both what brings people in, but also that the number one sort of like fruit of these practices is shame. And so the title is trying to reflect that by way of, a sweet little pun. But what I hope folks get from the collection, was that the second part of the question?
Yeah.
I mean, some people have said like, oh, this is going to change so many people's minds. And I'm like, no, it's not. Like, I know that this isn't. And yes, I would love for that to be the case. Yes, I would love for, conversion therapists to read this. I think like maybe 2 conversion therapists will read this. Actually, I know the reason why I say 2 is because there is one on Twitter who comments on my stuff every so often. He's
really?
like, I can't wait to read this book. Yeah. And I know he's a conversion therapist. And I just love it because I'm always just playing with him. Because I'm like, do you want to read this? Because there's a lot of discussion of penises. Like, is that what's going on here?
Is this the Pastor Dane all over again? Like, kind of wanting something and pretending that it's something completely different?
Yeah. He always says, he's like, this conversion therapist, he's like, in order to like, reach these people, like it's like you're me, like you're just a gay man who's like terrified. Well, I guess the difference is that you're terrified and I'm not. But he says in order to reach these people, we need to like know what they believe and whatever. And so that's his big idea. And I'm like, no, it sounds to me like you just want to read stories about penises. And I just keep saying this, he doesn't like it. So there's that. But I mean, I don't expect that other than this guy, any conversion therapist really is going to read this collection or support my work. And I love that they're supporting my work. That's like my favorite thing. So like they're actually putting money down.
Love that.
The other part though is that, again, so if in fact I don't believe that it's going to change many minds, and I don't, and again, I would love for that to be the case. I wish that would be an ideal world, but we don't live in an ideal world. I don't want to sort of like expect that. What I do expect, what I do hope for is that survivors read this and they are able to see themselves in some way, shape, or form through the narratives that are presented in the collection. That because I mean, obviously we have some cultural representations of conversion practices, right? We have Garrett Conley's Boy Erased, who actually Garrett wrote the foreword to the book, but and we have other sort of similar stories, and those are phenomenal, and we're so thankful for them, and they've laid the foundation and laid the way for other stories to come after. So we're grateful. The thing is, though, is that it's not the only experience of conversion therapy that's out there, and so this collection gives a broader sampling of conversion practices experiences. So I think that's helpful. The other thing that I hope for is that those who aren't who didn't necessarily go through conversion therapy but who are queer, I hope that they see themselves in this collection, because I think the way I think about conversion therapy is really it's just concentrated transphobia and homophobia packaged into one sort of presentation or one room or one pastor's office, whatever. And I think that if we are to understand conversion practices as those which are practices trying to change an individual to straighten them out in some way, shape, or form, I think that a lot of queers, they might not have necessarily undergone conversion therapy, but they have been subjected to conversion practices, right? When you're a little boy and you're sitting, like a girl, and dad slaps you on the back of the head and says, don't sit like that. Or a little girl is playing with trucks and her mom says, you're not playing with those and passes your adult. Right? These are conversion practices. These are, implicit or in some cases explicit ways of saying you are not, aligning yourself with the proper gender performance. Therefore, you need to change. So, right. So I think that queers will see themselves in that sense too. And I think that if we understand that, not to broaden the definition to, such an extent that everyone's included. No, like conversion therapy obviously still is specific to, certain contexts. But I think conversion practices as a term is certainly helpful when we understand homophobia and transphobia. At least for us when we grew up, I think that every queer who reads this is going to see themselves. And so I would hope for that. I think those are the two big takeaways that I hope people have. But beyond that, I'm just excited for the contributors who, are sharing their stories, and people are taking the time to read them. And, I've already started to hear back from some people.
I didn't even think about conversion practices, like, told, put on a shirt, do this, do that, that kind of stuff. You're like, wait. A lot of queer people would have gone through conversion practices and not realized it. So then by them reading this book, they can take away something from it and say, hey, yeah, I did experience part of this and I didn't realize, hey, I have had conversion practices that have been given to me by family members, friends, school, work, whatever it may be. And they can also see like how easy it could be to go down that path of conversion therapy and that kind of thing as well. So it's quite an interesting thing to think about.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing. I think that every queer has undergone conversion practices, in some iteration or expression. I think that it's the world that we live in is obviously straight. The world we live in is heteronormative, or at least it pretends to be, right? It's pretty queer if you look behind the curtain. But, I think that the problem is that we're obviously not straight and we don't fit that mold. And so us just being was so offensive to so many people that they tried to just make sure that we were in line. But we thank God, well, for a lot of queers, we're not, following that model. Some queers do, and it's unfortunate. But for the rest of us, I don't want to live a straight life. I don't want to live according to the ethics of straight people. And I don't think that those ethics are actually all that ethical. I don't think that they're actually all that they don't make much sense to me. And I don't think they make much sense to straight people either. That's the sort of irony. Yet they police these and enforce these standards and these scripts. But I digress. So I think that the collection gives voice to how other folks have undergone conversion practices, especially those stories that are about the family, and looking at how parents were the ones who pushed their children in this direction or forced their children into this direction. I think that when we read those stories, we can see, oh gosh, maybe my mom or maybe my dad or maybe my aunt, uncle, grandma, grandpa, whomever was in line and did something similar. And so I think that seeing yourself in these stories, I think can be powerful.
Yeah. And having worked through such traumatic experiences, how do you find hope and healing in your personal and professional life?
So I think academia really helped me a lot. And I don't mean to say that was like the only avenue that I pursued in order to work through a lot of this silliness. And, for me, I research trauma. Like that's kind of what I've been doing for the past who knows how long. And I wouldn't identify my specific experience as traumatic in a definitional sense. I do think it was damaging. I do think it was bullshit. I think there's a lot of crap that happened as a result. There's no doubt. But to call it traumatic, I don't think I can do that. Other folks can. And I know a number of people who not only identify like that, but you can see how conversion practices traumatize them. Like you can see the effects today. And so for me, like my experience, I needed a lot of sort of like, time and space to think through and then to feel through a lot of what happened to me. And I do think that academia and specifically div school, which is both academic and also a little bit personal or confessional or devotional in nature, that really helped me. And then there was, of course, I went to therapy. Like therapy is great. So that's helpful.
Real therapy is great.
Yeah. I always say, like, you shouldn't have to go to therapy after going to therapy. So conversion therapy, of course, is not therapy, but misnomer, here we are. So that was certainly helpful. And I think those things were ways that I was able to work through a lot of this. And also just having, solid friends, queer affirming friends and family. The majority of my family is phenomenal. Like not everyone, but the vast majority is just great and supportive. And so I have a really good family system. I have a really good friend system. I have a great group of friends or groups of friends. And talking about it, right? Like actually like verbalizing things. Like I think that the phrase that always comes to mind is coming to terms, right? People always say like, did you work through it or did you like, find victory over it or like whatever they want to say. But for me, I think the best phrase is like, did you come to terms with it? And in a literal sense, did you find terms or language to describe it? Sometimes the most radical thing we can do is just name what happened to us, right? And just say, this is what happened. This is what, I experienced. And when you're actually able to name it, then you're able to sort of like externalize it and say, okay, this is what I have. I've found language to wrap around my experience. And I'm going to be able to understand it a little bit better and figure out, what were the consequences? What did it do to me? And how is this still affecting me today? Because obviously there's messaging that I learned there and also within the wider evangelical church and also liberty in general, that I still see the effects. I still see, oh gosh, like, look at that. Like I'm doing this right now. And I think that's a function of X, Y, or Z. And so all this to say, I would say that like study, therapy, and a solid, network of people around me are ways that I was able to come to terms with what happened to me.
And is there anything you'd like to share with our listeners who might be processing their experiences with religion, shame, or conversion therapy?
I would say read.
Yeah.
And I think that's like finding voices of folks whose experiences are similar to yours or different from yours. I think that's the beauty is like, for me, like I found so much healing in reading stories that were so different from mine and finding a perspective that so contrasted what I had undergone or what I had experienced that was super helpful, but also finding voices where you do see yourself in the narrative. and also not just fiction or nonfiction. Obviously, the collection is nonfiction. These are all accurate, true historical stories. Anyway, the word "true" is something I'll just say it, true. And so I think that it can be super helpful, but also like reading, like some people have, like I'm thinking if we're thinking specifically of evangelicalism, like Matthew Vine's God and the Gay Christian, where, it's looking at theology, it's looking at, interpretation of scripture, and it's talking about it not in sort of a creative way, but in somewhat of a quasi-academic way, that these are texts that are also, helpful. Justin Lee's Torn, these other queer Christian or post-Christian, narratives that people have written that I think are really helpful with offering perspective. Also, like, get the hell out of that community. Whatever that religious community is, like, sincerely get out. Separate yourself, right? Like, you're not able to heal. You're not able to move on, at least in the way that you could if you're not in that community. For me, I literally left the country. Like, I went to Nashville, which was a mistake in and of itself.
I was like, Nashville, okay.
Yeah, dear Lord, Nashville, what an awful place. Don't tell anyone I know from Nashville that I said that. But I hated Nashville. It was just awful. It's like a small town. It's like you have it's the city in the South, and the South doesn't have many big cities. And so any city becomes a big city, like Nashville, Atlanta, New Orleans. And so all the small town bumpkins go to these big cities thinking they're going to the big city. And it's not a big city. It's just an overgrown city, or oversized city, overrun city, I should say. And then it just turns into a bunch of small town conservatives that live in this big city. It's terrible, a terrible place. But also, I love my school experience, but I didn't love Nashville. Anyway, so I would say that get yourselves out of those communities that are restricting you, and find a good community, find a queer community, find a community that or a queer friend at least, right? Like that allows you to express yourself, be yourself. I think that reading, getting yourself out of one community and into another, I think these are ways that are really liberatory and allow people to move not necessarily beyond the trauma or the hurt or the pain of what happened to them, but to again come to terms or work through or start to process these things. And I think these are really helpful and necessary steps to take.
Yeah. And how can our listeners find you and support you and your book?
So for those in Australia, if you're not interested in ordering it off of Amazon, which I can understand, I would say The Nile has the book. In Canada, it's Indigo Chapters has the book, and in the US, it's bookshop.org. So these are alternatives to Amazon. But if you want to use Amazon, I guess Amazon is an avenue to buy the book. And beyond the book, social media, I'm on Blue Sky, I'm on Instagram, Threads, all of those platforms. My handle is Luke Slam Dunk Wilson. And no, I don't play basketball. Believe it or not.
I was going to say slam dunk.
Believe it or not. And then on Twitter, I am Wilson_FW. And then I'm on LinkedIn, Lucas Wilson, and then Facebook, Luke Wilson. But yeah, those are the platforms I'm on where you can find me.
Yeah, awesome. So thanks so much for jumping on. It's been really interesting because one thing we've always wanted to do is talk to someone who's gone through conversion therapy and just have a chat and see what exactly is it, what can it mean, and what was, the experience. And so it's quite interesting to have a chat. And I didn't even think about the therapy, like one-on-one talk therapy, as a version of conversion therapy, which is silly for me to think about now. But you see all these horror stories and that kind of stuff. You hear about the, shock therapy, that kind of stuff, but never just the talk therapy. And that's probably what most people have experienced in some way or another.
Yeah, I think it's a pretty common experience. And again, conversion therapy comes in so many different, forms and expressions, but it certainly is quite common. And, and the collection gives voice to a number of folks who have a similar experience, whether it be in a church context or a ministry context or college context. But it is quite common, unfortunately.
Yeah. But thank you so much. I hope everybody's enjoyed this episode and listening to the incredible Dr. Luke Wilson. His book is out now, The Shame, Sex, Attraction. I hope that you guys have got something out of this. If you have, don't forget to give us a quick like, a follow, and do the same for Luke on his socials. But until next time, I hope that we have been
perfectly queer.